For those of you who are already online, Dr. Halsey will be with you shortly. While we're waiting for everyone else to be online, we will be playing a video for you on how to do social distancing, and we will go straight from there into Dr. Halsey. Thank you.
We hear the phrase social distancing a lot these days. Social distancing has slowed down its friends. That means we will run fewer meals, avoid gathering groups, stay away from many people. Social distance from people outside of your household. A 6-foot distance is recommended. Why is this important? Our healthcare system can only handle a certain number of sick patients at one time. That's the spot line, the capacity of the U.S. health system. The red curve shows what will happen if we don't drink it. This infection will quickly spread to a lot of people. Our hospitals won't be able to care for so many sick patients at once. They won't be able to keep up. With social distancing and good hygiene, we can help slow down the spread of the disease and reduce the number of people who get sick. This is the a fighting chance of taking care of everyone who needs it. That's what happened. That's what we mean by planning. We slow down the spread of the disease and we save lives. One of the most effective ways to fight this curve is to practice social distancing. So what does this mean for your everyday life? Some of the ways in which we connect with family and friends will have to be put on hold, like parties, lunch dates, group classes, or plays for our kids. Don't share objects such as toys, handshakes, or play anymore outside of the household. You may think it's okay to connect with just that one friend, but it can take up to 2 weeks for symptoms of the coronavirus to show. So the care is still important. Just that one connection will continue to spread the coronavirus and make the need for social distancing last even longer. But there are things we can do. And like technology, testing, and social media. Go for a walk or run. Live in your garden or shop for kitchen. Don't let things on your to-do list. Try podcasts, read a book, travel and hobby. That's also family time. If you do get to leave your home, control when the time is spent in public spaces like the grocery store. And keep a 6-foot distance between you and non-family members. Humans are naturally social, and social distancing may seem unnatural. But it's important. Finding new ways to stay connected all the chance to stop the spread.
So once again today, we are pleased to have Dr. Neil Halsey with us, who will be able to answer our questions about coronavirus, will be able to give us guidance, and find out what it is that we need to do to fulfill our mission to keep all the customers and staff at Emerge safe. So with that, Dr. Halsey, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm happy to talk with everybody again. those of you who listened into the earlier session. I really appreciate the questions that were submitted in advance. They helped me in thinking about what I was going to say, and also stimulated me to look up and find out additional information which I hadn't been aware of, which I'll be happy to share with you. I wanted to start with just a couple of anecdotes that I think help answer a couple of the questions you have. The first one is the story of my friend who I mentioned in the first call, who's a firefighter who did develop COVID-19 about 6 weeks ago, maybe 7 now, I think it may be. And his initial symptoms were just feeling lousy and muscle aches and a little bit of weakness. And he quickly recognized that those might be early symptoms, got tested, and was positive. He then quickly notified the place where he worked. I'm getting interrupted by showing my screen, which I don't think I need to do. And turns out that 5 out of the 12 people who worked at the same firehouse were positive and had all been infected by one asymptomatic individual. Now, my friend did okay. He was sick for about 10 days with developed fever, cough, and other symptoms, and then gradually recovered. He's back at work, but he's not fully back to normal yet. His own pre-COVID-19 strength and feelings of vigor, and he's a pretty strong, healthy, active guy. One of the questions had to do with long-term consequences. So I believe he's got a very good chance of having complete recovery, but those people who are more seriously affected in the hospital, and especially on ventilators, have very prolonged recoveries. And we don't know whether or not they'll ever be back to normal. There is some evidence that there is persistent lung damage in some individuals, but we'll learn a lot more as we get more long-term follow-up. And we actually haven't had enough follow-up time to determine the full answer to that question. The second brief story is the one that was in the news just yesterday about a young lady who went out with 15 of her friends to a bar in Florida. As you know, Florida has opened up quite a bit. And they all sat around the same table. This young lady had some mild symptoms, but really didn't feel sick enough not to do what she wanted to do, and has been desperately waiting to go out with her friends. So they went to this relatively small bar, and it turns out that all 16 of the individuals who were together developed COVID-19, as did 7 of the people who worked in the bar, and all apparently from somebody who had just minimal, almost no symptoms at the time. That's an example of a super spreader situation. We talked about last time that there's just a small number of people who are usually infected from each infected person. But when you change social distancing and you change the setting, you can really amplify the transmission of the virus, and so that many people get infected at the same time. And we don't know all the other factors. Some people have higher titers of the virus in their respiratory tract. Certainly the singing, the chanting, the cheering that goes on, sometimes in bars and other social gatherings, enhances the development of those droplets and the transmission of those droplets to other people. And that happened in this situation. And we're going to hear more about some of those other situations as the overall incidence of the disease goes down, and we are seeing people overinterpreting the relaxation of guidelines. And what they did was inappropriate, and each one of them recognizes it as per some interviews with the press. But keep those in mind. It's what can happen. We are seeing other people in other settings who are overinterpreting the loosening of guidelines, even here in Maryland, where we don't allow or shouldn't be allowed to do what those young individuals did. So I'm going to go through the questions that you sent in, and I believe there's the opportunity for you to ask additional questions through the chat function, and I think Brent Jones is going to manage that. We'll be monitoring those. I really don't mind if a question comes up during my answers to some of these that you think you need more information or more enhancement or clarification. So please feel free to chime in when you can, and Brent will be monitoring those, and he can interrupt me if I don't see them. So the question was asked by one of the individuals about how many strains of coronavirus there are. There are 7 that have now infected humans. There are 4 that are labeled human coronaviruses, and those 4 all cause the common cold. They're one of many other viruses that cause the common cold. More than 90 viruses have been identified, but 4 coronaviruses do. And so most people develop mild symptoms with just cough, runny nose, congestion. But there are some who develop more serious illnesses. And interestingly, that's in the elderly and sometimes in very young infants. And it's a characteristic of all the coronaviruses, and they've been tested in animals as well as humans, that there are people at increased risk. And I think by now everybody knows those risk factors, age being a predominant one with increasing risk of severity of disease with increasing age, but also people with chronic lung disease, heart disease, diabetes, any immunosuppressing condition, and people who are on a variety of drugs that cause immunosuppression for cancer therapy or for other autoimmune diseases and so forth, diabetes, and then there's a couple of others. But and I know that there are a number of Emerge customers who have these conditions, and we all want to prevent them from getting disease to the extent possible. Of the other 3 coronaviruses that infect humans are the SARS that was present from 2002 to 2004 and was more severe disease, had a 10% case fatality rate, and was controlled basically through case identification and social distancing and isolation of those people who were infected or in contact with infected people. And CDC and the World Health Organization played key roles in helping make that happen. Then a few years later, we had MERS, M-E-R-S, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and that had a 25% case fatality rate. People got infected from camels. Both of those viruses came from bats. Their intermediate host for the MERS was camels, who then acquired the infectant. And now with genetic sequencing, we now know that in fact the virus had circulated amongst camels for as much as 30 years before it jumped to humans or was recognized to jump to humans. All of the 7 coronaviruses that infect humans have come from animals, and bats were the source for 5 out of the 7, and sometimes intermediate hosts. Bats have been infected, bats are infected with other coronaviruses, and investigators in China have been looking into that, and there are a number of others. There also are other coronaviruses that affect other mammals. And I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody knows, the total number of coronaviruses that are out there. So the potential is there for additional problems. So the latest one that causes COVID-19 is labeled SARS-CoV-2 because it's the second one that is quite similar to the original SARS virus. The case fatality rate is lower, fortunately. Glad we don't have a 10% case fatality rate. We'd have at least 10 times as many deaths as we do, which are far too many than we have. So it's possible. And in fact, investigators in China predicted that there would be more human outbreaks more than a year before this outbreak took place, just because these viruses have the capability of jumping from bats to other animals and then circulating in other animals. So this may not be the only time we face a novel coronavirus. This may happen again, even with the same virus or with other related viruses. Questions asked about social distancing again. A couple of questions were asked about social distancing in outside areas. And now Maryland has opened up the beaches to people to be able to enjoy, but still maintaining social distancing. One question had to do with whether or not whether you need to wear a mask when you're on the beach. If you are maintaining the social distancing, the guidelines don't call for wearing a mask and being out there. And some people do, and that's fine. I think that's an added precaution. But when you're outdoors and maintaining social distancing, the guidelines here in Maryland do not call for wearing a mask in all settings. And I mentioned before, and I continue to walk my dog without wearing a mask every time I go outside, and I'm far away. I'm much further away than 6 feet. And we keep very clear from other people when we're out and walking around. Could the virus be transmitted in longer distances than the 6 feet? Again, I mentioned at the earlier call that we had that 6 feet is what has been observed for standard talking between two people and generation of droplets that might be transmitting the virus. If you cough or sneeze, you can transmit those droplets further, 9 feet, maybe as much as 12 feet. And so that's why we have to be very cautious, cover our face, bury your arm in your elbow if you cough or sneeze in all settings. We don't think outdoors that the virus will be transmitted long distances for two reasons. One, the breeze disperses those particles very rapidly, so you get very, very small numbers. And ultraviolet light from the sun, even when the sun isn't fully shining, ultraviolet light fairly quickly disinfects and kills those viruses. To the best of my knowledge, and I couldn't find any evidence of potential transmission in outdoor settings where people maintain that 6 feet distance. It's going to be continued to be monitored. And now that there will be more outdoor gatherings and there are people who are not adhering to the 6 foot guidelines, I'm sure we'll see more transmission. Don't go to big beach parties where everybody's cheering, drinking, bumping elbows and so forth. Because I'm pretty sure you could transmit the virus in those settings. Go out and enjoy the outdoors, enjoy the beaches, but be very cautious and continue to maintain the social distancing. Question about shopping in stores and people noting that there are others that are in the stores that are not being careful and not maintaining the social distancing. And in fact, in some store aisles and some grocery stores, you can't. If you're passing somebody and somebody asks, what's the risk? Well, we don't really know. If you're wearing a mask, you decrease that risk. I can tell you, I just look away when I have to pass somebody, and you pass quickly. I don't stop there and stand next to the person for any length of time. And I also note, as somebody else noted, that not everybody adheres to the general guidelines. And I would point out that national survey released recently suggests that 20% of the general population, adult general population, doesn't think social distancing is necessary. I mean, that's clearly not true. It does work. There's strong evidence in most states, not every state, that the careful social distancing guidelines have led to suppression of the curve of the epidemic in each of those states. And when those social distancing guidelines are relaxed, there's been a resurgence. And we know that that's happened. The numbers of states, it's a little unclear. Some report 12, some 16, some 22 states showing some resurgence as people have relaxed guidelines too much. But in stores, I also see some people who really don't seem to understand the germ theory of disease. And they're handling, 6 different melons or pieces of fruit and picking them up, setting them down, opening and multiple other, products that are there. And, I just avoid those people. And I avoid stores where lots of those people, have been seen and shopping. I was thinking of sharing a photograph I took at a Home Depot. I did have to go to a Home Depot in the last week, and I was taken aback by the number of staff who were not wearing masks properly, down below their nose primarily, and one below the chin. I have a picture of 4 Home Depot staff, only one of which was wearing a mask properly. So wear your mask, but wear them properly, and pulling it down below your nose just doesn't work. I know that some of the masks they're wearing, and some of them had surgical masks on, can be uncomfortable, and they have trouble wearing them all day. The cloth masks are more comfortable as a general rule, and now companies are making more comfortable masks for the general public, and you can buy them. They're more expensive probably than they should be, but they're becoming more readily available. So find a mask that's comfortable for you and wear it is the right thing. There are differences in masks. We talked about those last time. I'll just reiterate, the cloth masks do work. They do decrease the droplets that you get, that you secrete, that you transmit, and also they filter out, especially the double layer cloth masks, which they all should be, they'll filter out a lot of those droplets. The surgical masks are better. They'll filter out at least 80% of the very small droplets. The N95 masks are the best, but they're not perfect, especially because people don't get a very tight fit on them. And when you're in close quarters, you do want to try to have the best mask possible, but wear them properly is the most important thing with that. Let me just take a quick look at my notes to see the next questions. Again, had to do with the windy days and so forth. Long-term effects, dogs and animals. There is new information about that. Now there are several more dogs that have been shown to be infected, some of them without symptoms, and only one of them that I know of that had mild symptoms. Cats cats can also be infected, and there have been a number that have been shown to be infected, small number, handful now, but not just house cats, but tigers and lions at the New York Zoo have gotten infected, and they were symptomatic. That's why they were tested. Now, that's curious how tigers and lions got infected. My guess is it's due to the animal handlers, but that information hasn't been released. I don't think they got it from the wind. It seems unlikely to me, but most likely transmitted by workers in the zoo who were in closer contact or preparing their food and exposing them through that way. We'll have to learn more about that. So other investigators have tried to determine what animals can and can't be infected. And I had a list of them here. Let me just try to find them. So they can infect ferrets, Syrian hamsters, let's see, but mice, pigs, chickens, and ducks, they couldn't infect, which I found very interesting. That helps. If you can't infect chickens when you're trying to infect them, then it's probably not the chickens in the meat processing plants that are transmitting the disease. It's the close contact between the workers that are transmitting it from one person to the other and maybe leaving residual virus on the parts of the chicken that they're handling. But it's not the chickens that are getting infected and transmitting to people. Some of the other coronaviruses do infect some bird species, and some birds do get sick from them. So there are, again, differences between different coronaviruses that are there. But I found that interesting, that there are differences. And it's just like with other viruses, there are differences in susceptibility. Unfortunately, humans seem to be susceptible to many of these coronaviruses. And the exact number somebody asked me about, but I don't know the exact number of dogs and cats. Only a small handful of each one have been reported. Turns out mink, there's a mink farm that had an outbreak, and the mink got sick and died. Mink seem to be particularly susceptible to a whole variety of different viruses. That's a high-risk occupation in terms of trying to raise mink. Had one near my home back in Wisconsin, and I know that they had lots of problems. Somebody asked about wiping down the groceries. That's been the guidelines. Certainly, my wife and I have adhered to that. When we go out and buy groceries, we do bring them into a central place, then we wipe them all down and before taking them into the house. The one thing that we've decided to do is that for some of the dry goods, things that are not needed right away, just setting those aside for a few days will take care of the problem. Remember that the virus can persist on cardboard for only like a day, maybe a little bit more than that, on steel and plastic for up to 3 days. So things that you don't need right away, I think you can set aside someplace. Now, we go shopping when we have to, wearing the disposable nitrile gloves. And then when I come out of the grocery store, I take those and I put things into the vehicle through the rear door. Then I take the gloves off and throw them on the floor of the car for a few days. Then get into my car with my hand that hasn't touched anything and drive. When we get home, put gloves on again to move them. Now, we may be being more cautious than everybody else is, but we need to because we're both in high risk age category at least. CDC has recently stated, but I can't find the specific guidelines, that there so far isn't good evidence of indirect transmission from things like groceries and other things. So there might be some change in the guidance in the near future about this, especially as we see declines in the reported incidence of the coronavirus here in the state of Maryland, but and in a number of other states. So, but it hasn't happened yet. You'll have to make your decisions. We go shopping as infrequently as possible, much less than what we did before this outbreak took place, but watch for changes in those guidance that's there, but do be careful. Question about air filters in the home in a place where there is a person who's got COVID-19 or somebody who's recovered. Using these air filters, and the only ones that would make any sense are the ones that are HEPA air filters, HEPA. Those are the ones that filter out the smallest particles. Those are 3-micron diameter particles. They don't work perfectly to filter out all the viruses because the viruses are actually smaller than that, but they certainly filter a lot of the droplets that are in the air. It's not practical for everybody to buy those filters. And think about it, those are devices that are set in the room and they're trying to recycle all the air in the room. It takes a lot of time to get through all of that air. There's no harm in doing that. If you've got one, certainly it makes sense to potentially use it, but it's not a substitute for all of the other precautions that need to be made for preventing the transmission of disease. And you can do this. My firefighter friend, he was very savvy, very careful. He knew he was at risk. He didn't transmit to his other family members. Isolated himself immediately in the basement of the house, and family took special precautions. And I'm impressed they didn't get infected. And it's a good lesson for all of the rest of us in terms of what to do. Early recognition, early isolation, and very careful precautions. And you can do that. It is possible to do. Now in hospitals, they do have HEPA filters. In fact, they do double HEPA filtering in the isolation rooms, which are under negative pressure. And then all the air goes through those double HEPA filters before going out anyplace else to get rid of all those small droplets. Older hospitals don't have those. The newer hospitals do. Johns Hopkins Hospital, when they built it and opened in 2012, they put that into all of the intensive care and isolation rooms. I'm not sure whether they're in all of the rooms or not. I don't think so, but I think they're definitely in all the isolation rooms. But you can't do that. Other questions about what to do if somebody has been infected and what to do with that room. we have, there are guidelines for that. I'm virtually certain Emerge is following those guidelines in terms of trying to do everything you can to decrease the risk of anybody else acquiring it, including just leaving the room alone for a period of a few days. That'll take care of most of the problem. The droplets disappear within a few hours, and the surfaces that may have been contaminated are, the virus will die before somebody can get it. Hospitals use ultraviolet light, and actually in the isolation rooms that I was talking about, they actually build ultraviolet light into the upper parts of the room to inactivate virus particles and other things that might be infectious. But in other settings, they have these portable high intensity ultraviolet lights that they can put in the middle of the room and just turn on for a few hours. I don't know the length of time. You don't have those, you can't get them, but there are guidelines for disinfecting rooms. It's mainly leaving the room alone for a while and then wiping everything carefully down with the disinfecting wipes before anybody else goes in there. Other things, when somebody has been infected, is in isolating them. You try to, and I know this has happened at Emerge, and it's happened in many other settings. You put them in by themselves to the extent possible. There are places like nursing homes and others that have had to cohort individuals, where they can put two people who they both are infected in the same room if necessary, and have separate bathrooms for those people to use and not anybody else, and so forth. But very specific guidelines. We're not going to go through all of those. Those are published and out there. So one of the most interesting questions I had that did require me to look up more things was use of Uber. Would I recommend use of Uber at this time? And I've used Uber in the past. I haven't had to take an Uber taxi ever since this began. And I found a lot of very interesting information. Both Uber and Lyft have guidelines that they have posted for their drivers, and they have also provided sanitary wipes and the sanitizing gels for hand cleansing. And they've done, other things. And they both say they're no longer doing the ride sharing, lowest cost fares, and they're maximizing the number of people who can be in one vehicle, so nobody has to sit up front. And only people who know each other, at least for one of the two, is on their guidelines. And there's a nice review of this. There's some guidelines from CDC. There's a very nice review that was published by Consumer Reports last month, which I hadn't been aware of until I looked for it. And it is available to the public. I sent the link to Brent, who I hope he will post it, because it's very helpful in going through a lot of guidelines that are there. And so they're trying, but again, with Uber and Lyft, they don't have full control over the drivers, and I'm sure there's variability, the drivers. I think if you know a driver that is, in fact, following guidelines and taking precautions, and if you can use that same driver, that's what makes most sense. CDC has in its guidance advice to select taxis or drivers that have the divider, between the front seat and the back seat. Now, all taxis in New York City have had those for several years, but in fact, it's bulletproof glass in some of them, but that's New York City. And CDC sort of gave a preference for the use of such vehicles, but they didn't really say anything about not using Uber, Lyft, and some of the other things. I guess I'll share what Dave shared with me just before we talked, that he actually ended up having to use a Uber driver, and the driver had installed a plastic shield in between the front seat and the back seat. So it may be happening in some settings, but be selective, and obviously sometimes some people will have to use taxis or drivers. Who knows which one is better than the other one and who's going to adhere to the guidelines. The commercial taxis have, common vehicles that come to a place that they can all be cleaned and cleansed, and some are announcing that they're doing that. The problem in the area where I live is that the commercial taxi service is pretty unreliable and difficult. So that's why I had stopped using them a couple of years ago. So you're going to have to be careful and maybe talk with whomever that you're arranging to ride with and try to learn as much as you can. But be cautious. And obviously, it's better to minimize the use of any public transportation to the extent possible. But it's clearly not possible for everybody. You have to use it to some extent. Let's go to the next question. Is it possible to have the coronavirus infection and not have any fever? Absolutely, yes. Remember, now there are a couple of good studies showing that at least 15% of people either are totally asymptomatic or they don't have an illness that they would recognize as something that they think they need to seek medical attention or get tested or so forth. And we'll learn more about this as the antibody testing becomes more widespread to see exactly what proportion of the population, was infected. But absolutely, and amongst those who have symptoms, I forgot the exact percentage, but there are some who have cough and other symptoms, but don't have any fever. Now, whether they took their temperature, I don't know, but my recollection is it was around somewhere between 10 and 20%. So you can have the coronavirus infection and no fever. Absolutely, yes. And those people with minimal symptoms, those people with no symptoms appear very capable of transmitting the virus to others. And that's one of the biggest problems we've had in controlling this epidemic is this asymptomatic transmission, or what's now called pre-symptomatic transmission. We know you can be highly infectious for at least 2 days and probably 3 days before you come down with symptoms. And those are really causing a lot of the many outbreaks that we're seeing in many places. I think, and Brent will help me out here, I think that's the questions that you had submitted ahead of time. I don't see any other questions. I don't see the chat box. Brent, help me out here. Are there other questions that people have asked that they would like to have addressed?
Yes, I have 3.
Okay. Only one at a time, please.
Absolutely. Once you recover from COVID, can you get it again?
That's where there's been some confusion out there. And the evidence that has been generated in the last month suggests that you probably cannot, that the immunity from this virus does appear to be protective. Of course, no one has in fact re-challenged people. Some of the confusion seems to have arisen from people who may have thought they had it or had a false positive test for antibodies, and there's been problems with the antibody testing that continues, and then they got the disease. And they probably never had it the first time, which somebody had thought it was an asymptomatic one. We'll see more and more about that. Now, with some respiratory viruses, many years after you've been infected, you can acquire the infection again, but you usually don't get sick. And so I won't say that it cannot happen, but right now it looks like the people who have recovered have antibodies that protect against disease as well as other forms of immunity. And so at this time, my best guess is no, you can't. And that actually speaks well for the use of people who've been infected and then have recovered, I mean, those are the people that may be the safest to take care of people who are currently infected. And that's what's happening in healthcare worker settings. They're using those healthcare workers who've been infected and then go back to work. And they're still maintaining precautions. They're not going to drop those precautions, but those are the people who are probably at no risk of acquiring it a second time. Next question.
Absolutely. Do you think it's safe for people to come back to work after 14 days, or should it be longer?
Those guidelines, interestingly, have changed, and I note that there's some varying guidelines in different organizations and institutions. For people who have had symptoms and then recovered, and don't have any persistent symptoms, the virus is gone by 10 days. The 14 days provides an extra, caution. For people who have continued symptoms and are still sick, there are some people, and you've heard about some of these in the news, who still have evidence of virus more than 14 days out, even longer than that. Those are people who their immune systems haven't been able to control the infection. So it depends upon you having been free of symptoms. And I didn't look this up to see the specific guidelines here in Maryland, for that. But if you're free of symptoms, and I personally would like to see people free of symptoms for, more than 4 days, maybe even as much as 7 days, but I think the guidance was 4 days. And they're totally free of symptoms. I think it's safe to go back to work after 14 days. Interestingly, some organizations, and I won't mention them, have allowed people to go back to work earlier than that, and in fact required them to go back to work, or they don't get to use, sick leave. And I think that's wrong, but because I do think we need to have these extra periods of caution. But I think 14 days is fine as long as you've been free of symptoms for at least 4 days.
And Neil, if I could jump in. At the current time, the eMERGE policy is that you have to be off a minimum of 14 days, but you also have to have been off until you are 3 days completely free of symptoms, whichever is greater. We have one gentleman who became positive. He has now been off for over a month because he had the persistent cough. And his doctor is actually now doing multiple CV coronavirus tests that have to come back negative before he is able to return to work. So we see 14 is the minimum, but it will be greater than that until you have been symptom-free if necessary.
Okay, I think that's a very good cautious policy, but just clarify for me, those tests that were done beyond 14 days that this person has had, are those tests negative?
The person will have to have, we're following CDC guidelines. I think it's 2 consecutive negative tests within, and you would know better than me, is that within 2 days, I think, or 24 hours before they can be considered reliable.
Okay. I don't remember which one it is. I think they're separated by 2 days, but I'm not certain of that. I would mention, along the lines of what I said earlier, there is some evidence of some lung damage in people who've been infected, who've had, significant coughs and maybe X-ray changes. And so I'm not surprised that there may be some people who have more protracted cough if they've got some of that damage. But that is not necessarily a sign that they are still infectious. It's just due to the changes that took place in their lungs. And of course, people who are smokers and have other causes for underlying lung disease may be more likely to have protracted cough than others who are previously healthy without those risk factors. So a mild persistent cough is not necessarily a sign of infectiousness, but you're sure going to make other people uncomfortable around you if you're coughing and they know that you've had the disease. So. Was there one more question, Brent?
We now have 3 more.
Okay.
Is it important to stay home, and how much of the infection rate increases when we go outside to populated public places?
Well, I think we have seen with the resurgence of the coronavirus in a number of states following the relaxation of those stay home guidelines, that clearly going out to public spaces and interacting with other people is a factor. So social distancing does work. I think the guidelines for the state of Maryland that have been put out by our governor's office have been very good and very cautious. All of us know that not everybody is adhering to those, but I think if you adhere to the guidelines as they change, then your risk is minimal. But you do have to take responsibility and wear your mask and maintain the distancing and do whatever you have to avoid that close contact with others. We all need to get out. We can't stay indoors forever. It would drive me nuts. I mean, I couldn't have done that. So I don't think I would ever advise anybody, staying indoors, especially if you've got a place where you can get out of doors where you're not interacting with other people. And that can happen in the middle of the city. It can happen. It's easier for me. I do have a cottage in the Eastern Shore where I am right now, by the way, and I can go outdoors and I'm not within 100 feet of anybody, which is wonderful. I like it. Next question.
Once individuals have recovered, what are some post symptoms we might see?
Okay, well, we got to some of that with one of the earlier questions. I forgot to mention one important thing that is also new information that's emerged in the last month. Clearly, some of the people who've had moderate to severe disease have protracted symptoms, and feeling depressed is one of those. As many as 25% of people will have some symptoms. And that happens with other viruses. The one I know the most, because I had 3 employees who worked for me who developed dengue, and dengue is clearly associated with that. Infectious mononucleosis is something that many people are familiar with, also can cause a similar syndrome. And it sometimes takes weeks or months, to get over that. Exactly what's happening, I don't think anybody knows for sure. So feeling down, not feeling yourself, is something that happens. It's part of the host response to the infection, but be optimistic, it will get better with time, as it has with all of the others. I mentioned the cough that might persist if you've had significant, lung disease, some pneumonia, and so forth. So I think you will see some of that. You do see decreased lung capacity. That's noted as measured. They can find measurements with pulmonary function tests. And those abnormalities have persisted in people, and especially those more severely ill, those on ventilators and so forth. They continue to have abnormal testing for, a month at least, if not more, afterward. People with mild illness, with minimal illness, have much less of that and they recover faster. We don't have enough information about the recovery of a large number of people with different degrees of symptoms to be able to give you more precise details. But those are the things that I know about that can happen, more protracted over time. Last question. One more, not last question. We don't need to cut them off. We got plenty of time. So next question. If you're talking, Brent, I can't hear you.
So Neil, that was actually the last question that we have so far. So those of you in the audience, this is your last call for questions to Dr. Halsey. So if you have any questions that were not answered, please ask them at this time, please type them in for us. I do want to emphasize to everyone who is on the line that I hope that you will talk to your colleagues at Emerge. And our goal is to have everyone watch this video. But the other piece of this is that our problem that we're having is that people are becoming asymptomatic outside work. They're coming to work and they don't know that they're spreading symptoms until someone tests positive, which usually isn't triggered until someone else shows symptoms. So it is so important that everyone realize that you have to be careful all the time. And if you've been careful, but you talk to someone else who was not careful, that places you at risk. So, you know, if you're a staff person and you're doing everything right, and you talk to grandma, and grandma's been doing everything right, that's okay. But if grandma talked to Uncle Joe, and Uncle Joe was not observing social distancing, he may have given it to grandma, who is going to give it to you, and you're going to bring it to Emerge. So we all have to be in this together. We got to think about this as community, and everyone in a kind but firm way has got to tell everyone around you, and you got to be careful and tell everyone around you. You know, if you haven't been social distancing, you got to stay away from me, because we have got to work on limiting spread, because we don't know. People just don't know that they've got it. So I don't know if you want to respond to that, Dr. Halsey, or.
Well, I fully agree with everything that you've said, and it's obvious. It's hard for people to continuously maintain those guidelines, but we have to. Even as the disease incidence in Maryland goes down, I think we're down to somewhere between 300 and 350 cases a day in the state of Maryland. That's great. People have done a good job in general, but there still is transmission out there. And look at what's happened in other states. And there are people who are traveling and interacting with people from other places where disease is out there. So we have to maintain these guidance for now. And I don't know how long we're going to have to do that. But until not just Maryland, but other states, you know, also do that. I do, if there isn't another question, I did want to leave with a message, but let's see if anything else has come in first.
We have another question, Dr. Halsey, and the question is, do you have any insight on the study that was done on 3,500 people as to how people with AB type blood have more severe problems than those with type O blood?
I don't have any more insight than the person who asked the question has done. People are looking for potential genetic markers for increased risk. This is one of the interesting, I've studied infectious diseases for 40 years now, and one of the most fascinating things to me is the variability in terms of who gets sick when you get exposed to bacteria or viruses. And it's usually only a small proportion who develop severe illness, and not just with the coronavirus, but with the meningococcal bacteria, which can cause overwhelming meningitis and disease in people, but the vast majority of people don't get that. We're learning from many different infectious diseases about the genetic predisposition, and the HIV infection, we now understand better there. We will find, I say we in the global sense, other investigators will identify specific markers, and blood type might be one of those. But more precise genetic markers that are associated with the increased severity of disease. I'm pretty sure now, with the ready availability of genetic testing, that this will come out of this epidemic. And I welcome those. It'd be nice. I mean, the more we know about who may be at higher risk, the better. With regard to the specific blood types, it's probably not the blood type itself, but if there are real differences, then it's just a marker for other genes that control the immune response, to the infection. But any marker is welcome.
Okay, and Dr. Halsey, that was the last question, so you can close for us, and we do thank you for sharing with us again.
I wanted to share with you what came to mind, and that was a what I always thought of as an old Chinese proverb, which is, may you live in interesting times. I've studied infectious disease for a long time, studied previous pandemics, and thought we might be living through another pandemic, but I didn't really expect it to happen in my lifetime, but it has. Turns out it's not a Chinese proverb after all. It originated in England, and it was probably a misquote of another Chinese saying. So instead, I'll leave you with, may you live through the pandemic and live through to be able to tell stories to your grandchildren about what you did to deal with the pandemic for yourselves, and also what you did to help prevent transmission at Emerge, especially to the customers. And I thank you for that, and please continue to do so. I think